It was a chilly night in the fall of 1992 when 43-year-old Dennis Rowe began what was supposed to be a routine overnight haul across the state of Kentucky. The route was familiar, the long, empty stretch of Highway 70 between Paducah and Lexington, a run he'd done countless times before. Dennis had been a long-haul trucker for over 20 years. Colleagues described him as reliable to a fault, the kind of man who never missed a radio check-in, never showed up late, and never left a job unfinished. But that night, something went very differently. Around 12:47 a.m., his dispatcher received Dennis's last transmission. Clear skies, roads quiet. Stopping at the service area near Lake Redding for coffee. See you by sunrise. He never made it. By dawn, the truck, a 1989 Kenworth W900, hauling a load of industrial paint drums, had vanished from the map. No GPS back then. No dashcam. Just a man, a truck, and miles of open road that would soon become the center of one of the most baffling missing person cases in Kentucky's history. Dennis lived in Murray, Kentucky, with his wife, Karen, and their teenage son, Eli. The Rowes weren't wealthy, but they were close. Dennis was known in town for fixing other people's cars for free, attending every Friday football game, and joking that diesel runs in my veins. On the day he disappeared, nothing seemed off. He left home around 8 p.m., kissed Karen goodbye, and told her he'd call when he reached Lexington. That call never came. By noon the next day, Karen contacted the trucking company. Dispatch confirmed that the load was overdue. Police were notified, and within hours, troopers began retracing his route, but they found nothing. No skid marks. No broken guardrails. No trace of the truck or its cargo. It was as if the highway had swallowed him whole. At first, investigators suspected theft. Truck hijackings were not uncommon in the early 90s, especially for industrial materials that could be resold. But when they traced the serial numbers of the missing cargo, none ever resurfaced. Then came the tips, all dead ends. One trucker claimed he'd seen Dennis's rig parked at a rest area around 1 a.m., the engine still running but no one inside. Another said he thought he saw the same truck near the old Redding Bridge, a narrow 2-lane crossing above the deep, dark waters of Lake Redding Reservoir. But when divers searched that area, visibility was poor, and the sonar came back clean. Weeks turned into months. Karen refused to believe her husband had just driven off the grid. Dennis wasn't that kind of man, she told local reporters. If something went wrong, he'd have called. He'd have found a way. But by Christmas 1992, the case had gone cold. The Rowe family held a memorial the following spring, without a body, without answers, and without closure. Rumors and theories. In small towns, mysteries grow fast, and this one grew roots. Some believed Dennis might have staged his disappearance to escape financial debt. Others thought foul play, that he'd been ambushed by hijackers, or worse, that the company was hiding something. There was even a darker rumor, that Lake Redding itself held secrets. Locals said that since the 1960s, cars had occasionally slipped off the old road that once ran through the valley before the reservoir was built. When the water rose, parts of the original highway were left submerged, including sections that hadn't been mapped in decades. Old-timers said, if something goes into that lake, it don't come back up. Fast forward to 2010. A severe drought had lowered the water level of Lake Redding by nearly 30 feet, the lowest in living memory. The county's dive rescue team was called in to assist with a cleanup operation after old debris started surfacing. That's when one of the divers, Jason Carver, noticed something strange showing up on sonar, a large metallic shape buried deep in silt about 50 yards from the old submerged roadbed. At first, they thought it might be an old barge. But as the team adjusted their sonar angle, the outline became unmistakable, a long chassis, a cabin, and what looked like a cargo trailer. Jason said in an interview years later, "You could see the grill through the murk. It was a truck, a big one, and it hadn't been there just a few years. It looked ancient." When they surfaced and checked the historical records, the coordinates aligned within a few hundred feet of the last known path of Dennis Rowe's route. The county immediately called the police. After 18 years, they might have just found the missing truck. When the news reached Callaway County Sheriff's Department, they dispatched a full recovery team the next morning. It had been nearly 2 decades since the disappearance of Dennis Rowe, but for the detectives who'd worked the case back in '92, the mention of his name reopened a file that had haunted them ever since. Detective Paul Givens, now retired but still living in the area, drove to the site out of sheer curiosity. "We searched that lake more times than I can count," he told a local reporter. "If his truck was in there, it was buried deep. We just didn't have the tech we do now." The operation began at dawn. A specialized dive team from Louisville was called in, equipped with advanced sonar imaging and lift bags designed for large underwater recoveries. Visibility in the lake was near zero. Thick silt and fallen branches made every movement difficult. But as the divers descended along the old submerged roadbed, the shape became unmistakable. A Kenworth W900 truck cab, lying on its right side, its trailer partially buried in the mud. One diver's radio crackled through static. "We've got wheels, front grille visible. This is a full rig down here." The truck's headlights were long gone, its mirrors rusted away. But the blue paint, though dulled by water and time, was still visible. A crane barge was brought in. It took nearly 8 hours to attach the lift cables and slowly raise the truck toward the surface. When the cabin finally broke through the murky water, spectators along the shore gasped. On the side, faint but legible, were the words, "Rowe Freight Services." For the first time in 18 years, Dennis's truck saw daylight. Once on shore, investigators sealed the truck and began a careful inspection. Inside the cabin, everything looked frozen in 1992. The driver's seat was intact, the dashboard coated in a layer of black silt. They found an old CB radio, a crushed coffee thermos, and a torn Kentucky Road Atlas still open to the route between Paducah and Lexington. But what caught everyone's attention was the driver's seatbelt, still latched. Divers and deputies exchanged uneasy looks. If Dennis had gone into the water buckled in. When forensic technicians began clearing the silt from the driver's side, their suspicions were confirmed. Beneath the rusted steering wheel, partially covered in sediment, were human remains. It took weeks of careful recovery to remove and analyze the remains. The coroner's office confirmed through dental records that the bones belonged to Dennis Rowe, ending nearly 2 decades of speculation. Inside the truck, investigators also found several personal items. Dennis's wedding band, still on his left hand. A wallet, containing faded family photos. A logbook, its ink nearly washed away but with one final legible entry. 12:41 a.m., Lake Reading rest stop, coffee break. There were no signs of foul play inside the cabin, no broken glass, no bullet holes, no signs of a struggle. The leading theory soon formed. Dennis had likely pulled over at the rest stop for coffee, as he said in his radio check-in. When he returned to the road, dense fog may have rolled in, something that, according to weather records from that night, did in fact occur around 1 a.m. Investigators speculated he may have missed a curve or followed an unlit access road that sloped directly into the lake, which had no guardrail at the time. It was, in the simplest terms, a tragic accident. When the remains were officially identified, the sheriff personally delivered the news to Karen Rowe, now 61 years old. She'd never moved away from Murray, never remarried, and never stopped believing the truth would surface. Neighbors recalled how she stood on her porch for hours that evening, staring down the road, tears in her eyes. The following week, she spoke to local news for the first time in nearly a decade. "I always told myself Dennis would come home somehow. I just never thought it'd be like this. But now, at least, he's not out there alone anymore." A private funeral was held that spring. The trucking community from across the region showed up. Dozens of drivers parked their rigs along the procession route, horns sounding low and mournful as the casket passed. It was closure, but it came with questions that still gnawed at people's minds. When investigators examined the trailer, they found the industrial paint drums still sealed and secured, not a single one missing. That detail ruled out any theory of hijacking or theft. But one thing puzzled them: why had the truck's headlights been switched off? The ignition key was still in the on position, but the lights were turned to off. Had Dennis parked voluntarily? Or had he become disoriented, perhaps mistaking a boat ramp for the road? Some wondered whether fatigue or even a sudden medical emergency could have caused it. The coroner noted the possibility of a heart episode, though after 18 years underwater, there was no way to prove it conclusively. Still, for the sheriff's department, the case was now considered closed. Lake Redding became quiet again, but locals said things never felt quite the same afterward. Fishermen claimed that when the lake's surface was calm, you could still see the faint outline of tire ruts in the silt under the water, like ghostly tracks frozen in time. A small memorial was erected near the rest stop, now rebuilt with new guardrails and floodlights. The plaque reads simply, "In memory of Dennis Rowe, 1949 to 1992. A man who kept America moving." 4 years after, truckers who passed that stretch of Highway 70 said they always left their headlights on, even in daylight, a quiet tribute to a fellow driver who vanished into the night and finally came home. The recovery of Dennis Rowe's truck should have been the end of the story. After all, the remains were found, the cause of death was listed as accidental, and the case was officially closed. But in small towns, closure rarely comes clean. Within weeks, new rumors began to spread, not about ghosts or curses this time, but about details that didn't quite fit. Among the divers who helped recover the truck was Jason Carver, the same man who'd spotted it on sonar. A few months after the official report, Jason gave an interview for a local podcast that reignited the conversation. He claimed that when he first looked through the cabin window, both the headlight switches and the dashboard lights were turned off, but the gear shift was still in drive. If he drove off by mistake, Jason said, the lights should have been on. You don't drive a rig like that blind in the dark. Not Dennis Rowe, not anyone. That one statement reopened old doubts. Had the lights been deliberately switched off after the truck entered the water? Or was it simply mechanical failure, a short circuit caused by the lake? The sheriff's department dismissed the speculation as unreliable memory, noting that Jason's account came months after the recovery. But for those who'd followed the case for years, it was enough to stir a new wave of questions. When the investigation was reopened briefly in late 2010 to verify the recovery report, a detail surfaced that few had ever heard about, a dispatch tape that had gone missing for years. Back in 1992, every trucker's CB radio communication with the company was recorded. Most tapes were recycled after a few months, but a copy of Dennis's final transmissions had been kept, misplaced in a warehouse box until rediscovered during digitization. The audio was faint, but clear enough. At 12:47 a.m., Dennis's voice came through calm and steady. Clear skies, roads quiet. Stopping at Lake Redding for coffee. But right after that, something else followed, faint static and a muffled second voice. The tape analysts couldn't make out what it said, only that Dennis responded with a short, uneasy laugh. Then the transmission ended. The company insisted it might have just been another driver joking over an open channel. But Karen, when played the clip, shook her head. Dennis didn't laugh like that when he was relaxed. That was his nervous laugh. Something about that moment scared him. To understand what might have happened that night, investigators revisited the location where Dennis had planned to stop, the Lake Redding rest area, which had been torn down in 2003 after a flood damaged the structure. Old blueprints revealed something intriguing: a private maintenance road that branched off just beyond the rest area, leading down toward the waterline where the old boat launch had once been. In 1992, that road was unmarked and unlit, barely visible at night, especially in fog. If Dennis had driven down that path thinking it looped back to the highway, it could explain how he ended up in the water. But that road wasn't open to the public. It had been closed since 1988, blocked off with a steel gate. So how had Dennis's truck gone through? When divers examined the lake bed near the truck site, they found bent metal fragments consistent with a gate hinge. It appeared something heavy, perhaps a truck, had smashed through it years earlier. Was it an accident? Or was Dennis chasing something he thought was part of his job route? By 2011, an investigative journalist named Megan Dunn from the Courier-Journal began digging into Dennis's employer, Rowe Freight Services, which had quietly shut down in 1995. She discovered that, at the time of Dennis's disappearance, the company was under federal audit for improper transportation of hazardous materials. Specifically, the same industrial paints Dennis had been hauling that night. The drums recovered in 2010 were labeled as non-hazardous, but old records hinted they might have contained chemical solvents not listed on official manifests. If Dennis had realized what he was carrying, and if those materials were being dumped illegally, it could have given someone motive to keep him quiet. It was a far-fetched theory, but Megan's reporting raised eyebrows. She noted that 2 other drivers who'd worked for the company had quit abruptly in late 1992, citing unsafe routes and pressure to deliver overnight without full manifests. No charges were ever filed, and the company's owners denied any wrongdoing. But the story added a chilling undertone to what had once seemed a tragic accident. One summer evening, about a year after the recovery, Karen Rowe visited the lake again. She brought flowers, setting them by the memorial plaque near the rebuilt rest stop. A local fisherman, who happened to be there that day, later told a reporter what he'd witnessed. She stood there for a long time, just staring at the water. Then she said something real quiet, something like, "You didn't deserve that road." Nobody knew exactly what she meant. But to those who remembered her husband, it was clear she still believed there was more to the story. In 2013, another odd detail surfaced when Karen went through Dennis's old belongings, things she'd boxed up years earlier. Inside his toolbox, she found a small Polaroid photo, water-damaged but partially legible. It showed Dennis standing next to his truck, smiling beside a man she didn't recognize, a tall, bearded figure wearing a company jacket with no visible name tag. When Karen showed the photo to Dennis's former co-workers, none could identify him. The man didn't appear in any company rosters or employee records. To this day, his identity remains unknown. Even though the official narrative declared Dennis's death accidental, local historians and true crime enthusiasts continue to debate the finer details online. Some believe Dennis may have discovered the company's illegal practices and been forced off the road. Others insist it was simply the perfect storm: fatigue, fog, and a forgotten road leading to tragedy. Whatever the truth, one fact remains. If not for the drought in 2010, the truck and the man inside it might never have been found. By 2014, more than 2 decades had passed since Dennis Rowe's last run, and 4 years since his truck was pulled from the depths of Lake Redding. For the Rowe family, the discovery had brought peace, but for investigators, something about the case continued to itch at the back of their minds. The twisted gate, the missing tape, the unnamed man in the photograph, each detail painted a story that didn't quite fit neatly into the accident box. Detective Paul Givens, who had retired years earlier, decided to revisit the case files one last time before moving out of state. "I wasn't looking to prove anything," he said in an interview. "I just wanted to understand what really happened to him that night." Givens started with the original 1992 accident reports, grainy black and white photos of the old rest stop area before it was demolished. That's when something caught his eye. In one image, taken by a responding trooper during the first week of the search, a set of tire tracks could be seen curving away from the main road, but not in a straight line. Instead, they formed a half-circle pattern, as if the truck had turned back before disappearing. That detail had never been logged as significant. The report assumed they belonged to another vehicle. But when Givens compared the pattern to the recovery coordinates, the tracks lined up almost perfectly with the access road that led down toward the water. This meant Dennis didn't just drive forward into the lake. He might have turned around first, possibly to follow or meet someone. Hoping for one last piece of clarity, Givens drove to the remains of the old Rowe Freight Services yard, now just a fenced lot overgrown with weeds. Inside one of the decaying storage sheds, he found a few crates of discarded paperwork, manifests, old delivery routes, and faded employee rosters. Buried among them was a route sheet for October 6, 1992, the night Dennis vanished. The log listed his cargo destination as Lexington Paint Supply, but something strange stood out. The return route had been manually written in red ink, not typed, like the others. The handwriting wasn't Dennis's. It simply read, "Pickup Detour, Reading Plant." There was no official record of any Reading plant in state directories. Whatever it was, it seemed to have been scrubbed from the company's files after 1993. After a few weeks of digging, Givens discovered that there had indeed been a chemical treatment facility just north of Lake Reading in the late 1980s, owned by a subcontractor that supplied paint solvents to multiple manufacturers, including Rowe Freight's client. The facility had shut down in 1989 following EPA violations for improper waste disposal. But maps showed an old service road connecting the rest stop area directly to the plant's former lot, a road that was later sealed off when the reservoir expanded. If Dennis had been told to deliver or pick something up there, it meant someone within the company was instructing him to drive into a restricted area, a route that no longer officially existed. Maybe he realized that too late. Maybe he turned around at the gate, confused, and in the darkness, backed into the wrong path that sloped straight into the lake. Or maybe someone else was already waiting for him there. In 2016, on the 24th anniversary of Dennis's disappearance, a small-town journalist named Laura Hayes visited Karen for a follow-up piece. Karen's house looked the same as it had for decades, the old trucker's cap still hanging by the door, Dennis's photo framed above the mantel. When asked if she believed Dennis's death was accidental, she paused for a long time before answering. "Maybe it was," she said softly. "But I think he was scared that night. I think he found out something he shouldn't have. And I think someone made sure he never told anyone." She wouldn't elaborate further, but she admitted something she'd never told police before, that in the week before Dennis vanished, he'd mentioned being uncomfortable with a new client order and that he wanted to call things off after this run. To her, that sealed the truth. Dennis hadn't just lost control of his truck. Someone had sent him into danger, knowingly or not. Later that same year, diver Jason Carver returned to Lake Reading to assist with a separate environmental cleanup. He revisited the old recovery site, now marked by a buoy and GPS coordinates, and noticed something odd while scanning the sonar for debris. About 20 yards from the truck's final position, beneath a layer of sediment, was another metallic shape, smaller, roughly the size of a pickup truck. Local authorities investigated but found no vehicle, just the warped remains of an old aluminum boat. But according to Jason, it didn't look like a boat at all when he first scanned it. It had straight edges, like a container. Then the next week, when I came back to rescan, it was gone, like someone had moved it. No official report was ever made public, and the county closed the file soon after. By the time the case faded from headlines again, the story of Dennis Rowe had become something of a legend among long-haul truckers. On online trucking forums, drivers shared his story as a cautionary tale about checking your routes, verifying manifests, and trusting your instincts when something feels off. Each October, a convoy of independent truckers still makes a symbolic drive past Highway 70, honking 3 times as they pass the memorial site, once for Dennis, once for his family, and once for the miles left unfinished. In 2019, the state officially renamed that short stretch of road Rowe Memorial Mile. For the locals, it was a final tribute to a man who had unknowingly carried more than just cargo that night. He'd carried the weight of a mystery that still lingers beneath the lake. When asked years later what he believed happened, retired Detective Paul Givens said this: "Maybe it was an accident. Maybe it wasn't. But what's true is that the road he took no longer exists, not on any map. And maybe that's the lesson here. Sometimes, the worst turns in life aren't the ones we see ahead. They're the ones that were never supposed to be there."